This is Mahipal with the Immersion Foundation, and today we have a very, very interesting guest and one of the ambassadors of the upcoming Holy Blood, Holy Blade, Paul Portas. Paul, welcome. Very nice and very kind of you to be able to join us both at the event and making time for us in these podcasts starting today.
Well, I appreciate the invitation.
So, Paul, I had a good friend who introduced us, Brian. He's been bugging me about the SCA for years, and I kept telling him, like, I don't get it, man. I don't get what you guys do. It makes no sense to me. And I just kept pushing him aside for the longest time. And then suddenly it clicked. I was like, oh, wait a minute. How was I so thick-skulled? And I blame it on my mom dropping me on my head while I was a kid, but that's the story I'm going to stick with. But anyway, that's how it started. And then Brian connected us. So, but most martial artists and most guys, especially who are focused on Asian martial arts, have no idea what the SCA is and who are you guys and what do you do and why should I care? Okay. So that's the question, Paul. So
okay, well, the SCA is actually, it's not all fighting, although the sword fighting takes a very prominent place in it. Pretty much it's what draws everybody in, and then there are ancillary activities. People just follow their own interest in the group. It's a very, very wide umbrella. It was started as a sort of a May Day party back in like '65. And just a bunch of people who wanted to dress up in medieval clothing and stuff like this. And a lot of people came and they did some sort of fighting with, they were trying to come up with something to fight to kill each other with. And you see some things that happened back then and you go, oh my God. But anyway, everybody liked it. It kept going and it turned into, it's officially an educational research corporation, and that's where the fighting comes in. The fighting is the activity that draws everybody into the tournaments. Then you have people who are into armoring and costuming and medieval plays and medieval music and everything like that. It's not a complete recreation thing because there's a lot of, well, that's too much trouble, so we're going to wear glasses anyway, stuff like this. But the fighting had kept going and it kept evolving. I came in in the end of 1970 because one of my friends in one of my classes, just before I graduated from college, was in the group, and he knew I was a judo player, and he said, you really got to come and see this. You come and do this because you like it. And so I came and I loved it. I mean, basically, the couple of attractions in this setup. One is it's a full contact weapons art, and you don't get killed. And if you're careful, you don't get hurt. I mean, it hurts, but you don't get injured. And the other one, it provides a whole social activity behind this. So instead of going to the dojo and then after you're done practicing, going to the pizza parlor, there's this whole social group that doing things that you like but aren't really doing yourself so much. You have to do it a bit just to fit in. And so I jumped in with both feet. And at that time, I was a pretty experienced black belt in judo. Got my black belt at San Jose State University at a time when they were essentially the national champions in the US. And I found that judo worked really well in this thing. There's a no grappling rule, so, and I'm sort of glad of that. But all the way you move and move your opponents in judo works really well when you're swinging a sword. And so I just got into it. I was physically very talented, and then I knew judo. And as soon as I made the translation, I became one of the top and eventually pretty much the top fighter in the group. I suppose people would argue that, but I'm pretty sure of it. There have been people that came up later who matched me as far as success and stuff like that. So it's not just me. And after a while, I got sort of tired of it. I could drive to practice and I couldn't talk myself into armor. Or it took me a half hour or so. And I like teaching and I like the theory and stuff like this. I just kept building and building and building. And well, how does this work this way? How can I make it better? What do I really want to do? What's the real purpose of the tactics and stuff like this? And so here we are 50 years later, and I've been working on it the whole time.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. So I think from a sword fighting practice, right? So what are these sword fights like? I mean, have you seen them change over the years? What are there different categories? And like the people who are going to be listening to it are old guys who love blades, right? So now they have heard, well, fighting with full contact with blades, what is it? What are the different categories? How can I get involved?
Well, for most of in the SCA itself, until maybe just recently, all the blades are actually rattan sticks, pretty much like the Eskrima boys use, except that they're a lot bigger and a lot heavier. So my swords, I would use inch and a quarter, inch and a half rattan, and they'd be 3.5 feet long, and they're swung full force. I mean, and we wear armor. We're pretty strict. That's one thing that has really gotten a lot better is the armor. It had to. Mild steel, 16 gauge mild steel was probably the standard back when I got in, and now it's, I mean, the minimum you can use is like 14 gauge, and mostly everything else is stainless or carbon steel or something like this. And the armor has gotten very much more elaborate. There's still a lot of heavy leather and stuff like that, and padding and stuff like this, but you see guys in full plate or chainmail or coat of plates and just all sorts of things. It's just beautiful to watch because pageantry is part of the thing, so they do that. The rules are that if you hit somebody on a legal target, which is pretty much the entire body except the wrists and hands and below the knee and below, and that's more of a safety thing. In the early days, hitting below the knee was dangerous because we didn't have any armor down there. And so it's kept going like that. And if you hit the person hard, then that counts as either a wound or a kill, depending on what you hit. So if you got hit in the arm, you lose that arm, you have to fight with the other hand. If you hit a leg, you lose that leg, and you pretty much have to kneel down and continue fighting. We do use shields a lot. The weapons vary a lot. Sword and shield is the most common one. And then two swords, great sword, pole arm like a pole axe or a naginata or something like that. Then you have axes and maces and stuff like this, but there's no real steel blades. And it's gotten pretty intricate. The stuff that I do is, since I look at it and try to improve it and try to understand what's going on more and more, it's just fascinating.
Right. So how do you break categories up? Is it by weight? Is it by different weapon kinds, or it's free for all? Anyone can go against anyone?
It's pretty much a free for all. There's no weight classes, no gender classes. Sometimes they have tournaments that are restricted to one weapon or another, just for the fun of it. But in
general, I could come at you with a pike, and you could be with a double sword.
Yep. So yeah, that's one of the things that I do. I've developed styles for like 4 different weapons classes, and I always make them so that I can fight myself if I was using another weapon class.
Fascinating. So how does one progress? How does one progress through SCA? What's the journey to becoming a duke, so to speak?
Okay, well, in the society, we have kings and queens and princes and princesses and other ranks and stuff like this, knights and masters at arms. So we have like most of the SCA has 2 what they call crown tournaments a year. And the winner of that tournament becomes king for the next 6 months, and his lady, or vice versa, depending on the sexes. And that's how you get the permanent rank, because king is not a permanent rank. So if you've been a king once, then your permanent rank is count. If you've been in twice or more, then your permanent rank is duke. And they do the same thing for principalities, which are subsections of kingdoms. And again, if you win one of those, you're either the prince or princess, and you become a viscount, permanent. Because there are people that have been princes, 5 or 6 times, but the permanent rank doesn't change. And you get to be a knight simply by the existing members of the order of chivalry in your kingdom or area. Pretty much sort of vote you in. They don't really vote you in. They all agree that you should be knighted, and then they tell the king their recommendation, and he or she does it. You're knighted at a big ceremony.
Okay. So we talk about medieval combat. So how do you guys define medieval combat?
You're fading out a little bit.
So you talk about medieval combat. So how do you define medieval combat? So what are the parameters for weapons and weapon classes, and from what region?
Well, you have to have something that it's mainly basic European, and it has to be pre-Elizabethan.
Okay.
So before the rapiers came in, although in the SCA there is a whole class of fighters who are pure rapier. They use blunted blades, but they fight with rapiers and masks, and they actually require some protection too, so they don't. If a tip comes off, they don't get killed. I was sort of one of the guys that really studies that was told me one time that at least at that time, which was like the 1980s, 1990s, that even modern fencing had about four fatalities a year, and it was mainly because of broken blades.
I had no idea.
Yeah, they do this big
Lunge
like that, and somebody squats and does a stop thrust, and the blade breaks and it goes right through here.
Wow.
But the weapons now that they use, they're so springy, they probably won't do that. I don't follow that much anymore.
Okay. So how much of within the society, how much of the historical records do people study when they're constructing armor, when they're looking at weapons and fighting techniques? And is there a specific concentration, like more English or more Western European? I mean, those borders were very porous. They moved around quite a bit. I understand that. But in terms of core flavors that you find within the SCA?
It's mainly Western European. Well, Germany, Poland, and then England, France, Spain, whatever. And you develop a persona. Basically, you become a person in the group, and you create a medieval name and do a backstory as to how that person came up, and then you just progress on like that. But we're not limited to European. Actually, we have a number of samurai in there, and occasionally other things. I think we had an Aztec once.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Of course, they didn't use anything like the real armor and stuff, but so they had to modify it so they were wearing legal armor. The techniques, my stuff, I just made it up because I was working from judo, and I only vaguely knew about sword fighting. So they say, here's the rules. I say, okay, here's how I'm going to do it. And I just worked on that. There are other people who spent a lot of time studying the fight books from the masters. They're mainly Renaissance, but the Renaissance techniques were developed going through the medieval period. They have their own organizations, HEMA mainly. It's not the same kind of fighting. They don't do the full force blows, and it's nowhere near as fast. They'll say it is, but not that I've seen.
So what's a typical fight like in the fights that you were involved? I mean, no fight's typical, but like how long does it go? I mean, what does how do these matches generally end?
Well, if you've got some are if you're up against somebody who has a lower level of fighting, it can last like 10 seconds.
Wow.
They get in range and they get hit, and that's just
Yeah.
we can swing the things fast enough that if you're not trained in practice, you're going to get hit. Like there's the way I hold the sword, I hold it with the bottom fingers, and I use my body to throw the blade. I don't use my arm just chopping like this.
Mm.
And other people use it like this. I think it's a mistake, but they do it, and they do it by closing their hands and impelling the sword that way. I can throw a snap fast enough that you couldn't close your hands out to make it go that fast. You simply couldn't close your hand that fast. So that's how fast it gets. The sort of, you've got an even let's say you get up to the night level and you're fighting somebody about the same level, they can go on. I think I've had matches that lasted a half an hour.
Holy crap. That's a long time in armor.
It really is. I think one time it was one of my students who was a knight, and he was left-handed using a shield, and I'd lost a leg and I'm on the ground, and he kept charging me and he kept charging me and he kept charging me, and he couldn't get me. And eventually I got him, but it took like half an hour.
Wow. Wow.
I got in one fight one time. I remember I was fighting this guy who was a lot bigger than I was. I'm about 260. He's about 360. And we're both on our knees and we're both using two swords. And we had somebody time, we just continual swinging, and it was like a minute and 45 seconds. And swinging swords like that hard for that long is just exhausting.
Yes.
We each of us thought we did it for about 5 minutes, and they said no, we timed you, and it wasn't anywhere near 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Wow. I mean, I've had a few fights, and I know it lasted a minute or so, but it feels like an eternity, especially when you're getting hit and you're hitting. Those weapons suddenly become really heavy.
Yeah, well, see, you only get hit once really hard if you're lucky. I mean, if you don't fall down fast enough, that's how you signal you've lost. You fall down. If you don't signal that fast enough, they may be throwing a combination of 4 or 5 blows, and you'll get hit 3 or 4 times before you have a chance to fall down. But part of the game.
Part of the game. Part of the game. So what about the injury rate? I mean, how often do people get hurt, and how often do people get injured, like real injuries?
We're pretty rigid on our armor requirements. So we don't have many real injuries. Like we have this big war in Pennsylvania every year, and you'll maybe have a field with, a couple thousand fighters on it.
A couple thousand.
And it's group combat, so it's harder to stay alive that way. And most of the injuries are somebody stepped in a hole. That's about it. You get smashed fingers every once in a while. It's hard to armor the hands sufficiently to take this pounding, and sometimes the armor slips and the edge of the thing moves over onto the top of the finger, and then you get hit there, and that breaks the finger. I broke both arms in somebody's forearm once. He was one of the guys that actually I considered my equal eventually. He wasn't quite there, but he was good enough that he thought he didn't need that armor anymore, and it turned out he did.
Wow.
And concussions, I suppose we get concussions, but we have a lot less trouble than the NFL does. I mean, we wear a lot tougher helmets than they do. But if you've got it all padded up and it's heavy enough, and you got a neck that's strong enough to deal with it, I've let somebody hit me in the head with my own greatsword, and I could tell they hit me, but that was about it. Other than that, broken ribs once in a while, somebody steps in a hole, that kind of stuff. But that's about it.
Yeah. So Brian had sent me a few video clips, and I was watching them, and I was like, "Wow, this is sort of intense. I kind of dig it." And the speed is quite amazing, actually. Like people are not holding back; they are going for it.
Yep.
So what do you guys do to develop that kind of speed? Because the speed did amaze me, especially how you're swinging those big blades.
Well, I'm really into biomechanics. In judo, of course, there's all leverage and stuff like this, which really makes you pay attention to biomechanics and physics. And I actually got into where I studied both those areas, not extensively. I just don't have the time, but I can apply them real well. And when I need advice on how the body works in this way or how physics works for that, I go and ask experts, and they tell me, and then I incorporate that in there. And so I use a combination of weight drop, body rotation to get the speed of that.
Okay.
You see judo throws with the smaller guys, and you can't even see their feet move.
Yes, it's a thing of beauty, especially seeing old school judo.
Yeah.
So what about how does one somebody listening to this says, well, I'd love to go try my weapons out, and I want to see what my weapons can do. Maybe it's a saber, maybe it's a Spanish saber or a rapier, or somebody's like, oh, I've got this Filipino campelon, this big Filipino sword. I want to go try this out. So how would one do that?
Well, you would make a rattan version of it. Like a lot of people in the society they don't use cross-hilted swords. They use basket hilts.
Okay.
And so because it's really hard to protect the fingers. And so the hands, we outlawed the hands as a target, and this just makes sure you've got something you can put your hand into, and you don't get hit much. Really, really careful about that. But you can make it any style. You can make a katana, you can make an odachi, you can make whatever from any culture that you like, that you can build something that's sort of like a sword, or an axe, or a mace, or whatever the heck.
So in a weird way, it can be the testing ground for my theories with my weapon. If I follow the certain parameters of safety, I can say, okay, this is a weapon I've been working on. Now let me see how it would work against somebody else who's wielding something similar or completely different.
Yeah, we have that. If you're really interested in that, and I am. If you get some of the weapons like axes and maces, which for armored fighting are very deadly and useful, they don't work too well in our game because they're too slow, and they don't have the advantage of the real tip-weighted weapon with a lot of weight on the end because they're too slow. So not too many people use them. The serious people mainly use sword and shield or two sword, and there are a few odd people like me who use pull weapons and great swords too. And most of the great swords, they're these real long things that have, a place right at the base of the blade that has another little teeny hilt on, and those are useful in war. And you have to do a lot of grappling with them.
But you don't allow grappling with an SCA.
We don't allow grappling. And being a judo player, I'd rather they didn't, because there are some judo throws that are pretty easy to pull off against somebody in armor, and if you do it just a little bit wrong, and there's some really bad things that happen.
So let's say, all right, I say, hey Paul, you sold me on this. I want to go try my campelon out. How would I or anybody else listening to this somewhere say, okay, how do I get involved with this stuff and go play?
Well, there is a website, SCA.org, and you can go on there, and it has a newcomers portal, and it will tell you about the SCA and the activities. It'll also tell you can figure out where you live, and then you can try to find somebody that way. And Or there are a bunch of people that post on Facebook, like me. If anybody contacted me and said I wanted to get into the society, I'd set them up because I have all the contacts. And so would anybody, because we're always looking for more members,
Awesome. Well, you got one now after March. Once I get this out of the way and this hand gets a little better, I'll be back in jumping and skiing. Good thing Brian's just a street away, so that should be easy.
Yeah, I mean, you got a lot of pretty good fighters there. The style that I teach is, I call it a system, and you make from the system, it's how things work and how you put them together. And your style is what of that you use. Like in my book, my 5 major techniques, and totaling all of them, they are like 25 or 30 variations. You don't need to know 25 or 30 variations, but the 5 or 6 you do know, you get pretty good at.
Yeah. So what I would love to do, I think this is a good introduction to what we're going to talk about and how we move forward. I think in the succeeding podcast, I'd love to talk to you about your ideas about how do you get the opponent to do what you want him to do, because I loved your book, like I said, and that was the crux I took away from it. Get the guy to respond the way I want him to respond, right? So
yeah, that was actually really helped me solidify my own thinking on that, because I was doing it, but I hadn't put it all together, and
yeah.
I was putting it together. I had the concepts, but when I started looking at it, oh my God, you do this thing. And
yeah, I mean, that was the under text that I read through the book. I mean, it was not obvious to me right in the beginning, but I was like, wait, he's basically manipulating. He's basically working on manipulating me to do what he wants. That's the game.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It sort of came out of it. My level of skill compared to almost anybody else in the group was so different that it's always a little bit easier if you're careful to let the other guy attack, because then they make mistakes and there are tells and all sorts of things like this. And after a while, nobody would do that. So if I wanted to fight somebody, I had to initiate the attacks.
Right.
But if you initiate an attack, then you're putting yourself at risk. So how do I reduce the risk? Well, I make them make a mistake before they start fighting. And that's a lot of what my style does.
Yeah. I think you just defined the topic 2 for our second conversation, talk about your method of getting the other person to do what you want and how you started structuring it, and how can we break down those 5 pieces that you're talking about and maybe get into each one of those 5 pieces. I think that'll make for a wonderful second conversation, Paul.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, Paul, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you so much. For some, it's the quest of an empire. For some, it's been the quest of power and riches. For some, the quest for honor. And yet for others, the quest for freedom. Blades and bladecraft have done just that. So Richard Burton has said, the history of the sword is the history of mankind. And that's the journey we are on. No blade culture has defined the world as much as the Spanish bladecraft. And yet, no art develops in a vacuum. It is shaped by those that it interacts and fights with, and also shapes the cultures whether they are conquered or manage to maintain their freedom. In this particular lab, we're going to look at how Spanish bladecraft influenced arts across the 5 continents. We've traversed 20,000 plus miles, Wharton teachers with over 700 years of combined bladecraft experience together in one place at one time, where over 3 days and 40 hours of non-stop training, you will be able to see and experience firsthand how it shaped Europe, how it shaped the bladecraft of Northern Africa, how it developed the arts, both indigenous and otherwise, in Philippines.
moving over to Latin America from the jungles of Colombia and Panama, how the arts of machete developed. Coming further up north, looking at the arts of the southwest Mexicali region, where the long bullet was developed. Or looking at the development of a very American form of fighting, the Bowie playcraft. The impact on the Asian martial arts itself, with the Chinese art being completely transformed by fencing and fencing footwork. Lastly but not the least, is looking at the biomechanics of what full contact blade craft does, how it shapes your movement and what works and what doesn't work. This is the experiment we are embarking on. The lucky few who come here will get a view of 500 years of bladecraft that developed across 5 continents, and the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, between the wannabe conquerors and the freedom fighters, between those who fought as pirates and those who fought to maintain their honor. This is that experiment. This is holy blood, holy blade. For more information, look below.